Hello, everyone. We have all of our beautiful attendees dropping in now. That's fantastic to see. Welcome along. Okie doke. While we're waiting for everyone to arrive and before we kick off tonight's very exciting webinar, I would first like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we are all meeting this evening. Jane and myself are both coming to you from the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. And our guest tonight, Kim Rubenstein, is on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country in the Canberra region. And I would like to pay my respects to elders past and present. And I would also like to extend a particularly warm welcome to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are joining us here this evening. Wherever we're all zooming in from across the country tonight, we are all on First Nations land and sovereignty of that land was never ceded. So welcome everyone to our first ever installment of Reasonings with Jane. My name is Hannah Ma. I am the #2 Reason candidate for the Senate in New South Wales, and I'll be facilitating the question and answer section, which will be at the end of tonight's webinar. Our host for this evening needs no introduction, but I'll go ahead and give her one anyway. Jane Caro is an award-winning author and columnist. She is Reason Australia's lead candidate for the Senate in New South Wales for the forthcoming election. And joining Jane tonight is law professor, human rights advocate, and expert in constitutional and citizenship law, Kim Rubenstein. Kim is a distinguished law professor and an expert on how government should be run to serve the best interests of the community. She frequently acts pro bono in citizenship cases before the High Court, the Federal Court, and the Administrative Appeals Tribunal. And she's also made countless appearances on programs like Q&A and Insiders. And Kim is also running as an independent candidate for the Senate in the ACT. Tonight, Jane and Kim will be discussing the role of the Senate in Australian politics, as well as how the preference system works and some of the changes that have occurred in recent years. At the end, there will be a brief Q&A session. So if you have questions you'd like to ask, pop them into the Q&A section. It's its own special section. It's not the chat. There is a little Q&A button. Go to that one and ask your question in there. And we will hopefully be able to get around to it. If not, we will try and address any unanswered questions at a later date. So don't worry, you won't be forgotten. With all of that housekeeping out of the way, I will now hand it over to Jane to start the discussion. So please sit back and enjoy.
Thank you, Hannah. Lovely introduction. I'd also like to pay my respects to the elders on the land on which I'm sitting. As Hannah said, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. And as Hannah also said, it always has been and always will be Aboriginal land. Now, the Senate. The Senate can be a bit of a mystery, I think, to a lot of people. Most of us have heard of it, but I'm certainly guilty of this. I'm not sure that I completely understand exactly how it operates, what its history is and what it's meant to do. And it struck me that we're very fortunate that Kim Rubenstein is not just an independent running for the Senate herself, but an expert in all this kind of thing. And it seemed like a really good idea for the two of us to get together and have a chat. And I'll be learning a whole lot, and maybe some of you participating will also be learning some things that not all of us know. So really the first question I want to ask you, Kim, is the really, really obvious one. What is the role of the Senate in our particular parliamentary system? Why is it so important as the House of Review, as I've also heard it referred to on occasions?
Yes, well, first of all, thank you, Jane, for giving me the honour of being the first in this series of reasoning. And I just want to say how important it is for activating citizens around the country to really think about these issues, because they're so fundamental to the future of our democracy. And to thank you, Hannah, too, for organising this, and to just look outside before I answer directly your question, to connect myself to country and to really acknowledge the inspiration of First Nations in reminding us of how important it is to connect country and how meaningful that is during these environmental crises that we are experiencing at the moment, and the reminder of how urgent it is for us to recalibrate in order to truly appreciate and protect the environment. So that's just a little further affirmation of how important that reconciliatory statement is, not only to reconciliation, but also to the fundamental environmental issues that we're all no doubt motivated by to be sitting here too. But back to the Senate, and the Senate will have a role to play in all of these things, which is what's motivated me to run for the Senate. And the role of the Senate is so fundamental in our democracy. When our federation was set up, when the Commonwealth was set up, it has a House of Representatives where the government is formed, and which is why so much attention of the media is on the House of Representatives, because the government of the day is formed in that lower house. But equally important is the Senate, which was set up to enable the colonies that had been in existence before to maintain a form of power in a federal system. So it was actually set up as the States House. And that is why each of the states have equal numbers of representatives. So Tasmania, which is much smaller than Western Australia, has exactly the same numbers of senators because it was set up as a States House. That started as 6. But we are now at the stage where there are 12 senators for each of the different states. Now, so Jane, in where you're running for, ultimately there are 12 senators, but only half of those senators are up for election at this election, because the Constitution provides for that turnover to reinforce that it's a House of Review, that you don't have equal numbers of change, that you don't have the whole lot going. There's that sort of continual form of review. And we know exactly that half of those senators will be staying in and half are up for election. But the other key thing to point out for me as someone standing up for the ACT is that the ACT and the Northern Territory were not in existence at the time of federation, and their creation and the establishment of senators came about as federal legislation, because the federal government has power over territories. And so there are 2 senators for the ACT and 2 senators for the Northern Territory. So that's very different. The ACT and Tasmania are about the same size, but there are only 2 senators for the ACT and there are 12 for Tasmania. But the other thing is, for the ACT, it is only a 3-year term. So if I'm successful, I will only be there for 3 years, whereas if you're successful, you're there for 6 years. Now, I don't know if that's better or worse for you, Jane, but
no.
Ultimately.
We're yet to find out, I guess.
That's right, indeed. So that's an important thing, just to remember the starting point, that it was set up as a States House and a House for Review. Now, the reality is that with the development of our political system, that soon became very much influenced by party politics. But the added advantage of it maintaining its role as a House of Review and as a check on the government of the day's extent of their power is that the system of proportional representation was introduced in 1948. Now, I don't want to go on too much of a monologue here, but the system of proportional representation gives me the opportunity to shout out Catherine Helen Spence. Jane, I wonder if you hadn't heard of her before we were discussing this in advance. So for those of you out there who have never heard of Catherine Helen Spence, she was the first political candidate in the country. She was a South Australian who in the 1890s actually put her hand up, like we are today, to run for the Constitutional Convention debates in the 1890s. She wanted a place at the table to write the Constitution. And I tell you, we would have all been better off if she had been there. But thankfully, she was writing and sharing her ideas. And one of them was that she'd read Thomas Hare's writing about proportional representation as being the most effective form of democracy, the best way to get as much of a diversity of views of the whole territory or the whole electorate into a parliamentary framework. Now, interestingly, even though she didn't get to the convention debates, Andrew Inglis Clark from Tasmania did, and he read her work and he also advocated for proportional representation. And interestingly, and not an unfamiliar feminist or malaise or story that we can tell, is we know the system of proportional representation, not as it should be as the Hare-Spence system, because it was her idea, but the Hare-Clark system, because Andrew Inglis Clark took her idea into the convention debates. However, So that's a bit of a gender history story for everyone to know about this inspirational woman, Catherine Helen Spence. But proportional representation was introduced into the Senate, which meant that smaller parties and independents are more able to be elected, and we can come back to that in a moment. And that has then enabled, really since the 1970s, for most of the parliaments to be made up of an upper house where whoever wins the government doesn't necessarily have a majority in the Senate. And in fact, there have only been 2 occasions. The Fraser government in 1975 had a majority in the Senate, and then the Howard government in 2006. But actually, interestingly, in both situations, it came back as a backlash against them because they took that into, they became too entitled with their passage of legislation. But most of the Senate makeup has been a mix of the role of the crossbench, and that has enhanced its role as a house of review, because the government of the day must have all of its legislation passed by the Senate. The Senate has an equal role to play in terms of the passage of legislation.
I had not heard of Catherine Spence before you told me. It seems incredibly appropriate that the day after International Women's Day, we should pay due respect to the woman Absolutely. Who came up with this and had the credit taken away from her. What an unusual story. Not, sadly. And thank you. I now understand a great deal more about how we got the system we got, which I think, you know, a lot of us don't know our history and the history of our precious democracy. But there's been some changes recently, haven't there? You said this proportional representation system started in 1948. Yes. Now there were changes in 2016. Can you explain those changes?
That's right. That's right. So those of you who remember from the last election, that you get for the Senate a ballot paper which has both above the line and below the line voting. So you have the choice. Above the line are parties, and the parties are listed above the line, and below the line are the individuals who either make up those parties or other individuals who are not part of parties, like independents. Now, each of those frameworks provide for a system to enable you to preference, so that the idea is if you don't get your first preference, then that's not the end of your influence over the outcome in the election. You say who you would like as number 2, i.e. who you would want if you don't get your first preference, and it goes down the line. Now, before 2016, and this is probably why so many people are asking you, who are you preferencing? I'm being asked that all the time.
Me too.
Yes, so that comes from a mindset before 2016, where if you chose to vote above the line and you put number 1 next to the Reason Party, or if you put number 1 next to Kim for Canberra, then you didn't have to worry about anything else. Your number 1 vote would then direct your preferences. So in advance of the election before 2016, you and I would have had to lodge with the Electoral Commission what our preferencing would be. That finished after the 2016 election because it was not very democratic, in the sense that people were leaving that preferencing to the parties, and it led to a very odd result where one of the smaller parties that had only got a very small number of first preferences had managed to get elected by virtue of the other parties having preferenced that person in a way that they got up. And that wasn't necessarily what those individuals who had voted for the parties would have necessarily wanted, even though if they'd gone through the effort and done all the numbers, they could have seen that result. But the Parliament determined that it was more appropriate for individuals to actually identify their preferences both above the line as well as below the line. So when someone votes in New South Wales, if they choose to vote for you, Jane, and vote 1 for the Reason Party, they still have to make their decision as to who to vote as number 2. You have no power over their decisions. And that is just so important for active citizenship. This is something as an independent that I affirm, because it is about saying to each of you as voters, think about who you want as your first preference. But if you don't get your first preference, think about who you want as number 2. So that is a really important change that a lot of people haven't got their head around, and that's fair enough because people don't necessarily take this information into their mind every day, but it is really key for people when they're thinking about who they want to vote for in the Senate. We know that the majority of people in the country vote above the line, but they still have to vote when they vote above the line, not just a number 1, but 1 to 6 above the line. The Australian Electoral Commission and the Electoral Act says to you to vote from 1 to 6 above the line and 1 to 12 below the line. So you the voter, you choose that.
That's really interesting. And I think a lot of people, and because it's so new, like people are used to what they were used to, they haven't necessarily cottoned on to the changes. And I agree with you. I think this seems like a much better, fairer and more democratic way of us choosing who represents the public in the Senate.
Yes.
So we now know how voting outside the Senate works in terms of getting people elected.
Yes.
How does Senate voting inside the chamber work?
Yes.
So if the senators are there, and they're, you know, this is how, I'll tell you how I understand it happens, and you can correct me if I'm making some egregious errors here. A piece of policy goes up, it's gone through the House of Reps, it's passed. There may be amendments, who knows? Then it goes up to the Senate. And the senators then get to vote on it.
That's correct. And it follows the same process as the lower house. It's a very democratic process in terms of there's a first reading speech, there's a debate on the principles of the bill, there's an agreement on the bill in principle, then there are the detailed provisions that are analysed. So the Senate goes through the same process as the House. We will, if we're there, Jane, have to look at each of the different stages. And then the Senate has the capacity to either pass the legislation or to approve it, or it has the opportunity to reject it and send it back because there are things that we don't like about it. And this is where our roles will be significant on a crossbench in terms of the role we would have to play in improving legislation of things that we don't like, or we have the capacity to defer legislation. And that comes into an interesting scenario in our democratic framework, where if something is not passed within a certain period of time, it provides for a trigger for the government to call an early election. So it really is this notion of democracy at play, that we in the Senate, if we're there, will have a full role to play in analysing every single piece of legislation. And if there are things that the crossbench really believes are not good enough or don't fit into the principles for each of us, that for me, it'll be matters of integrity that are fundamental, but, you know, a whole frame of areas for us as a House of Review to analyse, then it has to go back to the lower house to then see if a version and amendments can be made that will then pass the Senate.
So give me an example, a concrete example of legislation that the Senate has in fact knocked back, sent back to the House of Reps. And via that process, that legislation has actually been improved.
Yes. So look, there was a particular period, and Natasha Stott-Despoja, I think, would be very happy for us to be referring back to some of the work she did when her role as a Democrat. She points out that the GST legislation was greatly improved by virtue of the work that the Democrats did at that time on that legislation. Some of the workplace relations bill and legislation, some of the border protection legislation, which I still, you know, think we have a lot of work to do on in the future in terms of the way that legislation has since developed. But there was a very strong period when the Democrats, who were keeping the bastards honest, really did have significant roles to play in terms of improving the legislation. So there are some examples. In my own work, I do a lot of work and submissions to Senate committees and parliamentary committees on citizenship legislation. And I'll give you an example of where a really significant amendment occurred. We now have legislation, and this is another whole topic that we could speak an hour about that in our Citizenship Act, there is a provision now for people to have their citizenship stripped that never existed before. It is in the context of terrorism, and I'm not saying that we shouldn't punish terrorists. I personally think it should be through the criminal law, not through citizenship law. But one of the provisions in the first iteration of this stripping bill was that if you were convicted of a Commonwealth offence and found guilty of some criminal Commonwealth offence, you could have your citizenship stripped. Only if you're a dual citizen. This is another issue. If you and I get into the Parliament, we're definitely not dual citizens. No. But if individuals are dual citizens and they, at the first iteration, committed any criminal offence under the criminal code, they could have their citizenship stripped. Now, one of those things that we identified in critiquing that bill as outsiders coming into a parliamentary committee to give evidence as experts was that if someone scratched a police car and was found guilty of scratching that police car, because that's a criminal offence in terms of property of the Commonwealth, that would have led to that person having their citizenship stripped. Now, that, of course, is bizarre and was picked up by the Senate committee system and therefore sent back to the House in relation to improving it. Now, I think, as I said, there's a whole lot else that could be improved on that bill. And if I'm in there, I'm looking forward to doing some negotiations around those sorts of things that are about inclusion rather than exclusion. However, the point is that really you could almost look at every piece of legislation and the role of the Senate is to improve the quality of our legislation. But I think the GST, border protection, citizenship are good examples of areas of legislation that have been greatly improved by a Senate that is not only reviewing it as a general principle of having another body checking over the legislation, but because of the composition of the Senate largely now being influenced by a crossbench, you get a more democratic review of what government has put up to the House.
So less kind of party line voting.
Correct.
And more critical assessment. And
yes,
speaking
exactly.
about the critical assessment, I mean, I think one of the things that a lot of people, when the only time they would see the Senate generally is often the Senate estimates. When you see, various senators grilling public servants about various things and doing deep dives. Tell us a little bit about how those things work. What's going on there?
So, yes, look, I obviously find this really fascinating in the sense of democracy at play, because what's happening in the Senate is it's an avenue for the people to come and for accountability to be played out to the public. And in many ways, that's what we want in the chamber as well. But in Senate estimates and in committee systems, you have this transparency and accountability framework. Now, let's just move beyond the Senate estimates, but to other committee frameworks which enable experts to come in and provide an avenue for engagement with the ideas. That's one aspect. And you see various Senate committees, you see various joint House committees. They're the real stuff of democracy that you don't necessarily always see reported, but it then provides an avenue for those senators who are members of those committees to then bring that material back in their judgment as to whether they pass or reject bills. So it really is a way of engaging with the public about those issues. But in Senate estimates as well, it's the transparency and having different members of having a more diverse membership of your Senate means that you've got different constituencies who are affected by those decisions of government, being able to question the government of the day and the public servants. And there's another whole issue about the independence of public servants, which is beyond us today. But ultimately, it provides for that transparency, and then it provides for an avenue for those interested, being the media, of course, who can keep a check on those issues that are brought up and keep reporting on those and providing for that transparency, but also for, of course, an opposition and a crossbench in the Senate to then be taking those answers and issues into account in the assessment of further legislation. So they are just such critical avenues for a broader sense of democracy at play. And I think it's about democracy not being about populism or the majority always dictating to the minority. It's about the majority taking into account the needs of the minority. And it's not about a bartering, in my view, and this is where I think the integrity of those people who you elect to the Senate is so key. It's not about a bartering system as such. It's really about engaging with the policies and the ideas, and having more diversity in your Senate enables that to happen.
Yeah, I was reminded as you were talking of that wonderful slogan that one of the American newspapers came up with when Trump was elected: democracy dies in darkness. And what I think you've just been describing is in fact the light being shone on the policies that are being put forward and what people charged with enabling those policies are doing, and the checks and balances that are being brought to bear on those, which sounds fantastic.
No, it's really crucial. And I see someone saying that often the government will take questions on notice so that you don't get an immediate feedback. But there are ways still for certainly the media and the public to monitor those. So I don't know if anyone else has done this before, but when there is certain Senate activity, you can sign up on the Parliamentary website to be sent updates when follow-ups occur. So, for instance, when the COVID Commission was set up, I was looking very closely at some of the issues from a gender perspective as to the questions that were being asked on the impact of women in COVID. So I signed up to get updates every time. And so every time that that committee makes some, does something, I get notified of it. And all of the citizenry can do that. Of course, journalists probably keep a greater check over those things when they're following a particular story, but experts or policy advocates, people like me from the outside who want to keep a check on government, can do that. I just feel like now is the time to take that inside Parliament and make sure that we actually get things done inside.
Well, leading to my next question.
Yes.
What do you think will be the relationship between the independents in the House of Reps and you in the Senate, if you, for example, or me, get in? Will it make for a more cooperative parliament, or, as I think some people fear, could it make for a more divided parliament, hung parliaments, all that kind of thing?
So I think we need to unpack a little bit about the nature of the makeup of a government and effective legislation or legislative programs. So certainly if neither of the major parties get enough to form a government in the lower house, and that they need to form a government with other independents, it will mean that they'll have to take into account more of the policies and views of those independents. It doesn't necessarily mean for ineffective government at all. It depends on the ways in which they themselves negotiate. We see that in so many countries around the world where that happens often, and many would argue that enhances the nature of the quality of the policy that is developed in the lower house before it then moves into the upper house. Now, if that is the case, that there are some independents who then are needed to form government, and some of the principles of their independence in relation to integrity in government, which I think is something that is motivating many independents, then you're more likely to get a government that is able to bring out the best of itself in committing to those principles. And we know that in the parties, there are a diversity of views. And this is something that I wanted to come back to too, Jane. Our party system has become too rigid in the way it expects its members to toe the party line. If you look at the United Kingdom, you often see members of the government of the day crossing the floor on particular issues. Now, of course, if every issue led to the crossing of the floor, it would be more difficult to get a government program through. But there are often core issues, and then there are outer issues, and those outer issues are benefited from having more views. And I think it's about the integrity and the commitment to democracy that those independents are bringing in. Now, if they are in the lower house and those issues are then resonated with the independents in the upper house, you're more likely to have, a healthy engagement in the issues rather than the personal political attacks. Because each of those independents are motivated by the policies at play, not the personalities. Now, if they don't get into the lower house, or they get in, but they're not necessarily making up the government, their voices will still be of influence. We've seen that in recent times with some of the members of the government of the day crossing the floor on certain issues, because of the recognition that there are diversity of views even in those electorates where people are being elected for a particular party. And again, I think that brings out the best in the parties, not the worst and overcomes the hurdles of what I see are the problems of the parties of today, which is part of why I'm running as an independent.
You've given an absolutely fantastic summary. And what I love so much is one of the things that motivated me, I think, is very similar to what motivated you, and that is a fear for the health of our democracy, basically, and the system itself, and the need for us to reinstate trust, certainly, in our institutions and our system of government, but also, I think, for our citizens to understand better how our system works and why it matters, and why letting it corrode or become undermined is unthinkable, because the alternatives to democracy, in my view, are unthinkable.
Well, we can look around the world today. I mean, that's it. The overstepping of executive government. I mean, this is something that really, I think COVID amplified it. When government is not accountable and transparent, it enables it to do more than what a democracy ideally needs, which is accountability and transparency. And we have been in a pandemic, and there are extraordinary circumstances that provide for certain measures that need to be taken, but they still, in a democracy, have to accord with liberal democratic institutions. And we've seen such a breakdown of things like freedom of information, things like our tribunal system, things that have led to us to need an independent commission against corruption. We wouldn't need it as much if those democratic frameworks which have been in place hadn't been eroded as much. And they're things that I'm talking to a lot in my campaign about, the fact that these liberal democratic institutions have been undermined so much that we're at the stage where we need an independent commission against corruption, but the need to use it won't be as great if we reinstate some of those things. So, and I think Rex Patrick as an independent in the Senate is a perfect example of how healthy it is to have independence. He's up for re-election, so we're not assured of getting him back in there, but his message has been so clear about the importance of freedom of information and transparency. And we've seen he himself, when you asked me earlier about improving legislation, we saw changes in some of the Treasurer's legislation on a range of different issues because of Rex Patrick's voice in the Parliament, in the Senate. He's had real influence, and they're things that are positive influences to enhance democracy.
Yeah. Well, I think we have reached the time, haven't we, Hannah, where we need to get some of the questions from our participants.
Absolutely, yeah. And we've had some real crackers, which is wonderful. So Rebecca has a question. So you were talking before about how the Senate is typically, the government of the time very rarely has a majority in the Senate, but the Senate is still very party dominated. It's still dominated by the two major parties. Does that mean that every senator will just vote as they are told to by their party, or do individual senators from the major parties actually sit down and scrutinize the legislation?
Okay, so two things there. One is that, of course, the way the party political system has evolved in Australia is that ultimately, even though those senators might have different views themselves and might share those within a cabinet setting, because, senators can be members of the cabinet as well. I didn't say that earlier, but our executive government ministers are drawn from both the lower house and the upper house, but you generally have to be part of the government. It would be very unusual. The ACT has seen an independent being made a minister, but essentially the government of the day chooses the ministers either as from the Senate or from the lower house. So they may, in their internal discussions, try to push for different outcomes, but ultimately the way party politics has worked is that even in the Senate, they'll vote according to party lines. But this is why it's so key to remember that they're not going to have a majority in the Senate. So even if they vote according to party lines, they're not going to be able to pass the legislation without a crossbench. So that is really that's why it's so important to remember when you're voting that no matter who wins government, they're not going to have a majority in the Senate. So you're thinking about your Senate vote is very different to who you choose to form government, because you know that even though they're forming government, they're not going to have power in the Senate. So you want to think about who do you want to have the power in the Senate. And, you know, the crossbench at the moment is interesting in the sense of at the current Senate at the moment, there are 9 Green senators, 2 One Nation senators, 1 Centre Alliance senator, Jackie Lambie and Rex Patrick as independents. So that's 14 at the moment on the crossbench who have real influence over the legislation. At the next election, you know, because it's a half Senate election, the crossbench is going to continue to be absolutely key. So please, voters, think about the Senate as a completely different framework for you expressing your democratic right and responsibility.
Fantastic. Another question. So we talked a little bit. Sorry, I got the croaky voice. Haven't got the Rona, I promise. Next
well, we're only
question.
seeing you over the interwebs, so it doesn't matter, does it?
No, this is true. This is true. So Helen asks, so we're talking a little bit about Senate committees before, but how do independent senators get appointed to Senate committees like estimates, for example? What stops the government from just loading it up with all of their mates?
That's a really good question, Helen. And I actually don't know the answer to that. So I think we're going to have to find out the answer to that. What are the rules in relation to committee makeup? That's very profound, and you would think it would be something that as an independent I should be investigating, because I've certainly been looking at the committees that I would like to be part of. I certainly want to be part of the National Capital Committee, for instance, because being a representative for the ACT, the review of decisions to do with the capital as a national capital, there's a lot here in Canberra, decisions around the War Memorial, for instance, and decisions to do with the National Triangle. They're all issues that cause a lot of angst here in the ACT. And that's a committee, for instance, that I would want to be part of. And maybe by being a representative for the ACT, maybe that would be a committee, for instance, that would be obvious that I would be on. But I'll need to find out the answer. If anyone else in the audience who's watching knows the answer to that question, please share that with us.
I've done a little bit of a wiki dive.
Yay, Hannah.
So the membership of the committees, of the Senate committees, are set out at the start of each new parliament in standing orders. And so the current makeup is, for example, the structures of committees. There's 8 pairs of committees with overlapping but distinct membership, blah, 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 blah. Number of members, composition, here we go. Legislation committees have 3 government, 2 opposition and 1 minor party. Reference committees have 3 opposition, 2 government and 1 minor party. So it is actually set out in standing orders that there needs to be a minor party or independent in the mix there.
Yes,
that's great.
It is interesting, but I wonder how this is the constitutional lawyer in me coming straight out. Who sets up those standing orders, and are they reviewable? Because if there are greater numbers of crossbenches, should there be more than just one? And I'll look into that, depending on the outcome of the election, as to the reviewability and amendments to do with standing orders, which are separate, of course, to legislation and so forth. They may be like delegated legislation. I'll have a look into that, but it's a great question.
Awesome. Jenny asks, could you please just explain briefly about what exactly is the crossbench for people who don't know the terminology?
Okay, so what we're talking about is numbers, essentially. In order to pass legislation, given there are 6 states with 12 senators and 4 territory representatives, what we have is 76 seats in the Senate. So if the government had more than half of that, then you don't even talk about a crossbench, because the majority is able to pass legislation. But what we mean by a crossbench are those people who are not part of the major parties whose vote are needed in order to pass any legislation. So they're not part of the Labor Party, they're not part of the coalition. Now, the Greens are ultimately will make up part of that crossbench, but the extent to which you need other minor and smaller independents will depend on the final makeup of the voting. But we know for certain that neither Labor or the coalition will have more than half of that 76, because only half of them are going up for election. So I've got all the numbers here, and if anyone wants more information about it, but we know for certain the crossbench is essentially those people who are not part of the major party whose vote is needed to pass legislation. I hope that explains it.
And I might be wrong, but I think the history of the term crossbench is because it's organised, the Senate, just like the House of Representatives, it's organised in terms of two banks of seats. And on one side is the government, and on the other side, the government benches, they're often called. There you go. And it's a
there we
U-shape.
go. So here's a picture. This has been drawn by one of my wonderful volunteers. But yes, I think that's right. The crossbench is the bit in between, the middle. That's right. So thank you to Ellie, who I'll shout out, who drew that, and he'll probably be extremely embarrassed that I've held that up for everybody. But it's the sort of thinking that is important in terms of the importance of that section of the Senate for the passage of legislation. And if Jane and I are elected, we will be sitting in those areas.
Awesome. All right, we are approaching time, but there are still two really good questions here that I would love to ask. Speaking of numbers, Chris asks, what percentage of votes will you both need to get elected?
Okay, great question, Chris. So proportional representation means that for the states where Jane is, where there are 6 senators being elected, the way it works is it's 100 divided by 6 plus 1, 7. So the percentage that Jane has to get is more than that portion of percentage. Someone can do the math quickly for me. I can tell you, for me in the ACT, because there are 2 senators, then essentially it's 33.33% of the vote that I will need in relation to getting elected. So it's a smaller proportion in the states by virtue of the numbers, but larger actual numbers, because as we know, the states are much larger than the ACT. So that's the answer to that question.
The larger the state, the more votes you have to win.
Correct. Yeah.
Yes, I think we were talking about this the other day in a meeting, and I think it was something like 600,000 votes we need in New South Wales to get you over the line, Jane. But that doesn't necessarily have to come from number ones though either. That's people using their preference flows
Correct.
to get it to the people you want.
That's right, exactly. So that also becomes really important, and maybe it's an aspect of preferencing that people should really think about who they want to put number 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 above the line or below the line up to 12, because ultimately, if you don't get your number 1 preference, then your number 2 preference could be key to getting somebody else the number of votes that they need as the minimum number of votes, and that's really key.
And that brings us really perfectly into our final question, which is a real cracker from Troy. Troy says, I want to use my vote in the most powerful way possible against my incumbent senator. Is it worse for him if I give him my last preference, or if I give him no preference at all?
That's a really excellent question, Troy. And I'm wanting to look at this in the most positive way possible, which is who do you want in rather than who do you want out? So I want you, Troy, to think very carefully about putting me as number 1, because I know Troy is in the ACT. If it is the same Troy, put me as number 1, put who you would, if you can't have me, and I know you, I really think that if you can't have me, who you would put number 2, and this is above the line through to number 6. Now, if there are more than 6 options above the line, then my guess is that the person who you want least is left off. They don't get any of your preferences. That would be my sense. And if there are less than 6 above the line, because at the moment in the ACT, it's just Labor, the coalition, I'm not sure exactly how, Labor, Liberal, the Greens and me, as parties, because I formed, the one thing I didn't explain earlier, I formed the Kim for Canberra party knowing that most people vote above the line rather than below the line. And so I created that party and created it authentically in the sense that it has the sufficient number of members who read my constitution and saw that I wanted to give it an independent an opportunity to be on a level playing field above the line. So that is available. We're yet to see if there are any others who will be above the line, but the more above the line and the more options, Troy, you would have to leave someone who you don't want off above the line.
Yeah, and of course, because I'm standing for Reason Australia, Hannah and I, that the party is above the line as well.
Yes, that's a good point, actually, that if you are looking for Jane on the ballot, your best bet is to look for Reason Australia above the line. If you're looking above the line for Jane Caro, you won't find her there above the line. You're looking for Reason Australia. And finally, Jenny's just really snuck in at the end there to say, so basically the key is to choose your own preferences. Is that a really good note that we can end on?
We can. And in fact, this is perhaps the other thing that I didn't add in before, and which is an important distinction in terms of the parties do not have control over your votes. But some parties recommend to their voters how they would recommend that you vote. Now, your point, the person who just said that is my point. You should not be guided by those parties. You should make that decision for yourself. If you want that party as your number one party, your number one choice, put them as number one. But you should continue to be an active citizen. Don't devolve and stop thinking and just follow what they recommend. I think you should think for yourself. And I certainly, as an independent, in the commitment to that active citizenship, but also to show all voters in the ACT, I'm independent. I'm not telling you how to vote. I want you to use your value system to frame who you want as number 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I'm not telling you, recommending in any way, because that is undermining of the very, very strong message Parliament is telling you to use your vote wisely. We need to reinvigorate our citizenry to do that. So that's what I would recommend. And Jane seems to be totally in agreement.
Completely agree. I mean, what do we call the Reason Party? What do we want you to do? Use your reason. Make up your own mind. All of us need to be doing that. We need to be looking. This is how, exactly as Kim said, we reinvigorate our democracy. We re-engage the Australian voters in being active in who they want to represent them. I just think this is a very important election, and the more people get actively involved and make their own decisions about who they want to represent them, the better the outcome will be.
Wonderful. Well, and if this session has helped those in the room and anyone who watches, then we've already won, Jane.
Yeah, that's right.
That this is what standing up for election is about. It's about really making people feel invested, that you have an obligation, you are responsible for voting. Use that wisely, because it's going to impact on every aspect of your life from the day after the election. Who gets in is going to have a real impact on your life. So please use that power wisely. Bravo.
Thank you, Kim.
Thank you, Jane. Thanks for the opportunity. Thanks, Hannah.
Awesome. Now,
Thank
Hannah
you
is
so
always
much.
wonderful.
The chat is full of kind words as well, and a lot of people saying things along the lines of, like, I didn't realize how much I didn't know, and I've learned so much that I wanted to know. So thank you so much, Kim, for joining us tonight. You've explained everything so wonderfully.
Thank you. Well, it's a real pleasure.
All the best of luck.
And same to you. You know, we want people, I think, as I've just said, we've already won if people listen to what we're having to say, no matter who they vote for, because as long as they've actually thought about it and really thought strongly about who would be best to represent them, then that's a win for democracy.
Absolutely. Great point to stop on, I think.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Okie doke. Well, let's wrap it up there. Thank you once again so much to our special guest, Kim Rubenstein, for joining us tonight. And of course, thank you, Jane, for hosting tonight. We'll be doing this again same time next week with a new guest. So keep an eye out on the socials. If you would like to get involved with the party, then head to the Reason website, or head to Jane's website, or find us on socials. We're on all of the regular ones. If you would like to get involved and volunteer or donate, or just keep up to date with what we're doing, because we'll be doing lots of really great little evenings like tonight. One final thing, Bella asks, will this be posted somewhere? Yes, it will. Reason, we have a YouTube channel. This will be thrown up onto the YouTube channel in the next few days, so you can keep an eye on that too.
And if I can just add the same message for the Kim for Canberra party, for those of you who are in the ACT to, of course, I think someone's put up the Kim for Canberra link there. Please go and have a look at my website, and really those of you in Canberra to get involved, to volunteer, all the things that Hannah just said for New South Wales. For Jane, we're completely separate. We're obviously motivated by similar principles in why we're doing this and why we've come together to share this information with you. But yes, please do go and look at the Kim for Canberra webpage.
Absolutely. Canberrans, get behind Kim.
Thanks so much, Hannah. Cheers.
All right. Thank you to you all. Thank you, Jane. Are you all good?
All good. Thank you.
Cheers.
All right.
Bye.
Ta-ra, folks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.